Hello, everybody. How are y'all? So it's Chris here again, and I am back to make another little video for you, real quick, to go with the circle versus gathered skirt playlist or series of videos that I'm making. These videos were based on a question that I got from one of my subscribers, and she wanted to know, are a circle skirt and a flare skirt essentially the same thing, or a circle skirt and a gathered skirt, and what's the difference? So I came up with a bunch of different questions, and I'm going to be answering those in these videos. So, anywho, so this one is going to be talking about why you would make that. Why would you decide to make either of those skirts? Would you decide to do, hold on, let me find my little, my notes here. Not my notes. Not my notes. There we go. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So this video is just going to be going over the 4 little things to think about. So they're not necessarily reasons why you would want one or the other. It's more so something just to kind of think about when you're deciding what kind of skirt you want. Now, of course, I have some things drawn here already because I actually made this video already one time. I had too much stuff on my phone, and and I didn't know that the video had stopped recording, and I was talking for like 20 minutes. So anyway, I don't know how much longer ago it had stopped, but the whole file was messed up or whatever, and so we can't use that. But anyway, so back to this. Okay, so you could do a straight skirt, but, or some other type of skirt. And the straight skirt would be this version here that just goes straight down. Okay. You could do a straight skirt, but straight skirts aren't really all that dramatic. They're not super interesting. They're just a basic skirt, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you need, right? So I'm going to pull this light over a little bit to make it just a tad bit brighter over here. Okay, cool. So anyway, so that's cool if that's what you need. In order to make it a little more dramatic, you could go in a little bit and you could do a pencil skirt. And so that would be really, really cool. And it would be nice and sexy. The only thing about pencil skirts, you just got to make sure you give the skirt a vent in the back. And when I say vent, I'm basically meaning in the back of the skirt, there's going to need to be an opening here that's going to allow for you to still be able to walk, or the person that you're making the skirt for. So that way she won't have any issues with her stride, and she can wear those heels that she wants to wear, and she can look real, real sexy. But anyway, if you don't want to go that direction, then you could go out, and you could make some form of flared skirt. And then the 2 skirts that we're looking at are, of course, the circle and the gathered skirt. Now, so let's go over the thing you need to think about. Number 1, the flare. Okay, so the flare, if we look back at the pictures that I used for the previous video, the flare is going to be different depending on which skirt you do. The reason for doing either of these skirts is just because you want more fullness, right? You want a skirt that's a little flirtier and that will, kind of float around your legs when you're walking or whatever. So you do something with a lot more fabric. And either way, the hem is going to be bigger in either. But the hem is going to fall slightly different, even though down is the general area. They're going to fall and hang slightly differently just because of the flare. And the flare is tied to the grain line itself. So, also from the first video, now you'll have to bear with me. I know this is kind of ugly, okay? And I'll draw actually another one on this side. So, with a straight skirt that just has the gathers in it, essentially, or the gathered skirt, usually the simplest version of it just has a grain line that goes up and down. Okay. You could also, the grain line could also go right to left, meaning like the lengthwise grain on the fabric could go right to left. It wouldn't change it that much because like the lengthwise and the horizontal grain, it's not a big difference. There's not a big difference between what it makes the fabric do to where you won't even notice. Like you could use one or the other, and it's not like someone's gonna walk up to you and be like, "Oh, you shouldn't have used that direction. You should have used the other direction." It's not a big deal. Okay. So anyway, normally this is how your grain line is going to go. You have these two choices. It just depends on the spacing of fabric you need, and we'll talk about that some more a little later. But with a circle skirt, and we'll draw these just because it's easier to draw a circle skirt if you draw in the quarters one at a time. Okay, so it's not a perfect circle, but who cares? It's just to illustrate the point. And this is the part that's gonna sew to the waist. And then this is the hem. Okay, so let's say this is your lengthwise on your fabric. Okay. When you're looking at this, and you know, that's your selvage or whatever. When you're looking at this, this is your lengthwise grain. Okay. And you're probably like, oh, okay, well, that's obvious. Well, yes, it is. The thing that makes circle skirts so much prettier is that, let's say this is center front here, this is center back, and this is your side seam. Oops, whatever. That's supposed to be side seam, not S8. But anyway, the skirt is going to fall differently where the bias comes across the hem of the skirt. So that would be here, and there, and there, and there. All of that's going to make the skirt kind of look different. So you'll get something that looks a little more like this, and the skirt is going to hang in a very particular way depending on how you place the grain line. And then you have more options here because you could also do a version of this where you could do a version of this where instead of having the grain line go this way, you could have the grain line go this way. Yeah, so I'll just draw the diagonal on there. So this will still be center front. And instead of the grain line being this way, we're going to make the grain line this way. Now, you're probably saying, okay, well, now I'm a little confused because I don't understand what you did to change the grain line. And it looks like I just drew in the bias. Well, essentially, because I know this is center front, right? Let's look at these one at a time. If I look at this grain line, this is essentially saying that the center front and back, because of this circle skirt, is going to fall along this straight grain. This one is saying that kind of like the area in between the center front and the side seam is going to be where the straight grain is. And that's what's different. Because I didn't just draw where the bias is, but we're still going to place it this way on the fabric. We're essentially now saying that now your fabric goes this way. So now this is your lengthwise grain. Oops. And now this is your circle skirt. So your center front is actually on the bias now. Okay. And that is what makes your skirt fall in these different ways. So you can get more flexibility out of the flare of the skirt if you change your grain line. So I'm going to show you this out of my Pattern Making for Fashion Design book. It's a book that we had to use in class. This book is essentially, or there's a chapter in here that is about circle skirts, or skirts in general, and then circles and cascades and whatever. So on mine, if you have the version that I have, which, do I have the front of the book? I don't know if I have the front of the book. But anyway, so this is it, Pattern Making for Fashion Design, 4th edition. Okay. On page 295, it is showing the grain line placement relative to the fall of the flare. And it shows you here 3 different grain line examples and the way that it makes the skirt fall based on which grain line you chose. So over here we have grain line number 1. So this is center front. So this is kind of showing you like what I was showing you here. Okay. So center front on your skirt pattern. So this is just like a normal straight grain. Okay. This is showing you the normal straight grain here. Okay. And so the straight grain, because it doesn't really, the flaring comes from the bias area. So the straight grain, you'll know because, or even the side seam, which in its own way is kind of straight grain. The skirt is going to fall flat and lay close to the body on the straight grain. It's going to fall away where the bias is. Okay. So that will tell you, oh, okay, well, I want it to be kind of flat in the front and I want it to hang out more to the sides. So maybe I'll use just the normal straight grain. Now the bias is the one that I like a little bit more, just because I just like the way that the bias looks. I like for it to hang away from the body at the center front. And I feel like that makes the skirt a little cuter and a little more flirty. And then the straight grain ends up falling kind of in between the front and the side seam. So it's almost like the opposite. So you here, the bias and the curving of the hem falls in between the center front and the side seam. Here, the flat straight grain falls in between the center front and the side seam. So hopefully that's not confusing. But anyway, so that is the difference between those two. And then this third one is the slightly off bias grain line. So this is straight grain line, this is the bias, and this is the slightly off bias. And basically, like I told you, this would be like the lengthwise grain coming this way if you used grain line number 1. Excuse me. This would be like placing the straight grain like this. So now your straight grain, your fabric is like this, and your pattern piece sits just like how it is looking like that. This last one would be like having the straight grain here, and then having this flare that kind of goes off like that. Okay. So it's something to play around with. If you're interested, I would definitely suggest you get some fabric and make some skirts, and I might even actually do that for you. That way I can have a physical example to show you. Yeah, because I think that would be really cool and really interesting. So yeah, let's just say I'm gonna do that. So anyway, that'll be like in one of the videos in this series. I'll show you the different circle skirts. Okay. So anyway, so that's flare. We spent quite a bit of time talking about flare because that's, to me, the main difference. The gathered skirt that's put on the straight grain line, it's pretty much just going to fall straight down, and it's not going to kind of sit out like the flare skirt. But the gathered skirt is going to have way more fullness overall than the circle skirt, just because the gathered skirt is going to involve way more fabric altogether. The circle skirt is actually, in its own way, a way to keep from all the extra fabric. And then it also, you get a seam at the waist, like if you're connecting it there, you get a seam that is in its own way a lot less bulky if you use a circle skirt. If you use the gathered skirt, it's going to have all that extra fabric going into that seam. So if you're not sure what to do with your seams at a point like this, then stick to this one while you still kind of figure out what you're going to do with that one, okay? Anyway, so we're going to try to run through these other two a little quicker. That way this video won't be so long. So anyway, so now for seam lines, that's the next little thing you should think about. And the way I think of this is you're trying to decide, what you need to do with your placement and what your design looks like. If your design has a bunch of seam lines, and you can see kind of where I drew this in the previous video. If your design has a bunch of seam lines on it, and maybe you're doing like what they call a gourd skirt, then it really doesn't matter which one you do. It just depends on, once again, if you want the gathered look or this, because you could also gore this skirt and you could have a seam line there and a seam line there and a seam line there. But if it's important to you to not be able to see the seams as much, I would suggest, number one, using a lighter fabric because the seam doesn't seem to be as noticeable in thinner fabrics. And then also to use the gathered skirt design. Just because you can hide some seam lines a little bit more in all of this fabric. Whereas with this, because you know your seam up here is flat and your hemline essentially is flat, you can't hide a bunch of seams. So if you're, I guess look at it like if you're being forced to have more seams than you want to have, just, you know, because of how much fabric you have, then I would go for this design if you can. And it might be the spacing on the fabric, not so much how much fabric you have, but you know, you don't have a lot of big whole pieces, so you might have to cut it up, but you don't really want to see the seams, and you don't want to go buy more fabric, then I would probably go with the gathered. But like I said, if you have enough fabric, if you have enough big spacing of fabric, and you don't want to see so many seams, then I would go with this one. Okay, and here's a little visual example from the last video as well, or I think it was, but anyway, so this is an example of a circle skirt that just has one seam in the back, and to me, it's a lot prettier, and you don't have to keep up with the direction of the grain line if you just use a circle skirt with just, you know, the one seam. If you do a circle skirt that has all these gores in it, either you're going to end up just doing straight grains on all of them, which in my opinion is going to kind of mess up how the skirt falls, and it's going to mess up the reason why you would use a circle skirt. But it's up to you. You know, it's up to you and the design that you're trying to do. So there's just some stuff to think about. But anyway, amount of work. So that's the next one you have to think about. On your gathered skirt. Dear heavens. Okay. So there have been times when I have made a gathered skirt, and I apologize if my room looks messy behind me. I don't know if you can see it or not. But anyway, there have been times when I have made a gathered skirt, and I was pulling the threads and the thread broke. So let's look at that real quick. So here, this is a little picture that I drew. On this one, when I do my gathered skirts and then I just have a big piece of fabric that needs to be gathered up, I'll backstitch here at the beginning and then, you know, just stitch down here and I'll just stitch right off the edge of the fabric, or maybe I'll stop like a little bit before the edge of the fabric. But that way I can go ahead and gather it up and start the process of, so what you'll do is you'll hold the threads here. You'll hold the threads there, and then you'll slowly start to scoot this down. Scoot, 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 scoot. Like I said, the only problem is every now and then, because of the tension that the fabric is giving on the thread, or that it's putting on the thread, your thread may snap. And it's going to piss you off, I promise. Because you're going to be halfway through with your gathering, and you only got another half to go, and that part took you a good 5 minutes to scoot the fabric very delicately. And now that's 5 minutes that's gone out of your whole life. But, you know. So if you feel like that might be a problem for you, you might want to use something that, like a thread that's a little bit thicker. And so you won't have that problem. Also, it's important to remember that if you're going to do this method, that you use a basting stitch so that you're not using this itty bitty stitch. You're using something where the stitches are a lot wider, or the stitch length is a lot wider on the stitch. That way you won't go crazy trying to scoot the fabric down. So anyway, so that's something to think about with that one. With the circle skirt, it's just easy. You just, you know, plan out your pattern piece or whatever. You cut that, you cut the inside, you cut your seam line, and you sew it to the thing, you know, and that's it. With the gathered skirt, I mean, of course, there are other things that you could do. You could also, if you don't want to go this route, you could also just kind of hand push the fabric underneath the needle, I do suggest being careful because you could actually end up sewing into your finger, and that's not gonna feel too good. So, but yeah, so you could do that, or maybe have some other thing that you can find to get it gathered. But the point is just to get it gathered down so that you can sew it to the waist and be done. Okay. Last thing is the amount of fabric, and this video is running about 20 minutes now, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. The amount of fabric that you need for each of them is going to vary. It's going to depend on a lot of different things. I kind of talked about amount of fabric a little bit in the previous video where I was answering what's the difference between a circle or a gathered skirt. I'll put the link in the description, that way you can find it. But anyway, yeah, so the amount of fabric that you're going to need, okay, let's talk about that really, really quickly. Okay, so in this example, I was looking at a pattern piece or a skirt or whatever that's about 26 inches long from the top of the pattern piece down to the bottom of the pattern piece that has the hem included. 26 inches long that way and 78 inches long this way. And where I got the 78 inches from is I took, let's say an example, or for example, 26 inches for the waist, and I multiplied it by 3 in order to give me enough fullness so that it would be nice and dramatic. And that gave me 78 inches wide for the waistline. And so you make it that long, and then you're going to gather it down. So you have 3 times the amount of fullness, 3 times the waist, so that your skirt is going to be really, really full and dramatic and gorgeous, okay? So I did that, and then the piece is going to be 26 inches wide. Because it's a gathered skirt pattern piece, you can do this either way. It just depends, or you can face the piece either way. It's only going to depend on how much fabric you have, or how wide your fabric is and how wide you need for, the skirt to be gathered down. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day which way you face it, because like I said, your grain line is not going to have a big effect on how the skirt ends up looking. So, but you might have a pattern or some stripes or something that you're trying to keep a certain way. So it's important to take all of that into account. But at the end of the day, as far as how it falls, neither the grain line is going to have a big difference. So it's up to you to figure out, do I have enough fabric to face it this way or that way? What I was drawing here was maybe you have this big cut that's missing in the fabric. And so maybe all of this is missing. And you're like, well, crap, I can't face the pattern piece that way, so all I have is facing it down this way. And the same thing with the circle skirt, except for with the circle skirt, you're going to need all that fabric. So it's going to depend on which way you want it to face. But you're going to need quite a bit of fabric to get this one thing done. Now, of course, you can cut these up into pieces. Just with the circle skirt, if you want it to fall a certain way, just remember to keep track of your grain lines on all 1 million of your pieces. Like I said, it's better to just be able to kind of fold your fabric up and just cut it. And then when you unfold it, it looks like it needs to look. You have your seam line in there, you sew that together, you sew this to the waist, and then you're done. With the gathered skirt, you have a little bit more work, but like I said, so anyway, I don't know, I'm starting to ramble. Just figure out all of these things, and it's all going to be based on what your design is, but also what look you're going for and what fabric you have at the end of the day. Do you want a lot of seam lines? Do you want a certain type of flare? Do you want to kind of hurry up and get it done? And do you have quite a bit of fabric or nice big empty spaces, or not empty spaces, big pieces of fabric where the whole piece of fabric is there, So anyway, just some stuff to think of. I am Chris, and I didn't stop it, did it? No, I didn't stop it. Okay. Anyway, so I am Chris, and I will see you guys later. Leave me some questions in the comments. If you are confused or you need me to elaborate a little bit more, I'll try to turn as many things as I can into individual videos. That way, it'll give me more content to post. And then that'll help other people because stuff gets lost in the comments sometimes, and everybody is not going to track down everything I've ever said or every question that was asked, because y'all don't see that stuff. I see that stuff. Anyway, let me know if you need anything. And give me a like. And if you've never subscribed to my channel and you liked what I talked about today, then subscribe to my channel. Other than that, thank you very much. It was great seeing you guys again, and I will talk to you later in the next video. Bye-bye.